She stood in the hallway, just a few feet from the front door. It was a quiet evening in Uppsala, a city blanketed in snow, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold behind one modest apartment wall. Her father, Rami Shahindal, had arrived unannounced. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply pulled out a gun and fired. 2 shots, one to the head, one to the jaw. Fadime collapsed before she could scream. She had defied him by choosing love, by choosing freedom. And in his mind, that was enough reason to kill. This is not a story from a distant war zone or a forgotten village. This happened in Sweden in 2002. This is not a story of silence. This is the story of Fadime Shahindal and the cost of speaking out against. Welcome to the crime series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. In the early 1980s, Sweden opened its arms to those fleeing unrest, poverty, and persecution. Among the many who arrived was a young Kurdish girl named Fadime Shahindal. Born on April 2, 1975, in the small rural village of Elbistan, nestled in southeastern Turkey, Fadime's early life was shaped by the deeply rooted traditions and conservative values of her Kurdish heritage. But Elbistan would not be Fadime's permanent home. When Fadime was just 7 years old, her family made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. They emigrated to Sweden in search of better opportunities. The journey from the dust-swept villages of Turkey to the icy sidewalks of Uppsala was both literal and symbolic. Her parents, like many others, arrived with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope for a better future, and fear that the customs of their homeland might be eroded by the freedoms of the West. The transition was not easy. Uppsala, with its universities and progressive ideals, was a world apart from the traditions they brought with them. For immigrant families like the Shahindals, survival often meant clinging even tighter to their cultural identity. Community leaders urged families to protect their honor, to raise children who would not stray from the values of their homeland, even if the streets they now walked were Swedish. Fadime's childhood quickly became a delicate balancing act. At school, she thrived, picking up Swedish fluently, excelling in her studies, and making friends from different backgrounds. She was described by teachers as bright, kind, and full of potential. But the rules at home were different. In her household, obedience was prized above independence. She was expected to be modest, quiet, and most importantly, to prepare herself for an arranged marriage that would preserve the family's honor and traditions. The idea of honor, or namus in Kurdish, carried profound weight. It dictated everything, from how girls dressed to whom they were allowed to speak. A daughter's behavior reflected directly on the family. Any deviation, especially in the realm of romantic relationships, was seen as a stain that could only be cleansed through severe consequences. By the time she reached her teenage years, Fadime was living in 2 very different worlds. At school, she saw classmates dating, wearing Western clothing, and speaking freely. She longed for that same freedom, but at home there were rules, there were warnings, there were eyes on her at all times, not just from her immediate family, but from the wider Kurdish community. Gossip, once sparked, could spread quickly and mercilessly. Still, Fadime began to push boundaries. Quietly, cautiously, she tested the limits. She dreamed of becoming a social worker, of attending university, of forging her own path. But even these ambitions were seen as rebellious. Her family, particularly her father Rami and brother, considered them dangerous distractions from her true role: to marry a suitable Kurdish man and to maintain the family's honor through quiet obedience. At age 18, Fadime received an acceptance letter from Mid-Sweden University, a moment that would be a source of pride for many young women. But Fadime's parents intercepted the letter and hid it from her. They believed her pursuit of higher education would further distance her from their control. When she eventually discovered the hidden letter, she didn't hesitate. Despite her family's anger and mounting pressure, she chose to go anyway. It was not just a decision to attend university, it was a bold refusal to let her life be dictated by control and silence. She left Uppsala and moved to Östersund, where the air felt different, colder, yes, but also freer. At Mid-Sweden University, she began studying social work, driven by a desire to help others like herself, young women caught between tradition and personal freedom. And it was there, in this new chapter of her life, that she met Patrick. Patrick was Swedish, gentle, open-minded, and unaware at first of the cultural barriers surrounding Fadime's world. Their connection was immediate, built on long conversations, shared dreams, and a growing understanding of one another. Patrick didn't just see Fadime as a woman from a different background. He saw her as intelligent, kind, and courageous. Someone determined to write her own future. To Fadime, Patrick became more than a romantic partner. He was a symbol of everything she had fought to reach, a life of choice, not control. With him, she felt seen, not as a daughter under constant scrutiny, not as a girl walking a tightrope between two cultures, but simply as herself. But Fadime's love story was never going to be simple. Even as she found happiness in her relationship, she was haunted by the consequences that could follow if her family found out. For women from strict honor-based cultures, the choice to love freely often comes at a price. Fadime understood that better than most. The concept of honor was not just an abstract principle in her family. It was the foundation on which every decision was built. And in this context, honor was deeply gendered, policed through a daughter's modesty, her compliance, and above all, her obedience in romantic matters. Fadime's choice to date outside her ethnic and religious background was not seen as a private decision. It was viewed as a threat, an open challenge to her father's authority, to her brother's control, and to the reputation of her entire extended family. She tried to keep the relationship hidden. For a time, she succeeded. But in communities where privacy is often a luxury and gossip can become a weapon, secrets are rarely safe for long. Eventually, someone told. It wasn't just the discovery that she was dating a non-Kurdish, non-Muslim man. It was the realization that Fadime was not asking for permission. She was living her life in defiance of what had been laid out for her. Her family's reaction was swift and severe. Confrontations followed, screaming matches, accusations, and then the threats began. Her father and brother both issued ultimatums: end the relationship, return to the family's expectations, or suffer the consequences. What those consequences would be remained unspoken, but they didn't need to be spelled out. Fadime had heard enough stories from within the community. She knew of girls who had been forced into marriage, others who had been sent back to their home countries, a few who had simply disappeared. Rather than submit, Fadime took an extraordinary step. She went public. In an act of tremendous courage, and some would argue desperation, Fadime contacted Swedish journalists. She spoke openly about the threats she was facing. She detailed the emotional and physical abuse she had endured. And she revealed something few had dared to admit in public: that for many immigrant girls, their greatest danger did not come from strangers in the street, but from within their own families. It was a revelation that stunned the Swedish public. For many, Fadime's story challenged the belief that integration alone could solve the complexities of cultural conflict. It forced a nation to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that honor-based oppression could exist, even in progressive societies. Her interviews were calm, articulate, and deeply personal. She never expressed hatred, only a desire to live freely, to love whom she chose, and to shape her own future. Her family, however, saw these public disclosures as a profound betrayal. Her father disowned her. Her brother intensified his harassment. Even members of the broader Kurdish community in Uppsala turned their backs on her. She was now labeled a disgrace, not for breaking the law, but for exposing what many believed should have remained a private, internal matter. What made her story even more painful was that, despite all the public courage, Fadime was still very much in love. Her relationship with Patrick remained the one constant in a world that had become increasingly unstable. He supported her as best he could, though he too struggled with the weight of her reality. But just as it seemed they might be able to move forward, perhaps even build a life together, tragedy struck. In a swift, heart-wrenching way. Patrick died suddenly in a car accident. His death was a huge blow to Fadime. The man who had stood beside her through her darkest moments was gone. And with him went the future she had been fighting for. Friends later recalled how she mourned quietly but deeply, grief-stricken not only for the loss of her partner, but for the possibility of a life that now felt irretrievably out of reach. For some, this would have been the end of the fight. But for Fadime, Patrick's death became another reason to keep speaking out. She understood now more than ever the value of love and the price that comes with its denial. By the late 1990s, Fadime had become a reluctant public figure. She appeared at women's rights events, gave interviews, and consulted with lawmakers on how to address honor-based violence. Her voice was steady, but her situation remained perilous. Even as the Swedish public came to admire her bravery, her family never forgave her. And behind closed doors, the threats continued. Behind the headlines and public appearances, she was still grieving. Her relationship with Patrick, which had ended before it even begun. And although she appeared strong in interviews, those who knew her say she was often afraid of what her family might do, afraid of how her story might end. But even in fear, she pressed forward. And in doing so, she became more than just a victim of circumstance. She became a voice for the silenced, the hidden, and the endangered. Fadime Shahindal's battle for freedom had only just begun. It was the evening of January 21, 2002. Uppsala, a city known for its intellectual calm and Nordic charm, had settled into its winter stillness. Inside one modest apartment building on the outskirts of the city, the stillness would soon give way to something irreversible. Fadime Shahindal had returned to Uppsala under cautious circumstances. For years, she had lived independently, away from her family's reach. She had crafted a life of her own, one forged not by defiance for its own sake, but by a belief in autonomy and safety. Publicly, she had become a leading figure in Sweden's conversation around honor-based violence. Privately, she remained careful, rarely visiting Uppsala except for necessary moments, always staying discreet, mindful that proximity to her family could still carry danger. That night, however, Fadime made a deliberate choice. She traveled from her residence in Sundsvall to visit her mother and younger sisters. The meeting was not publicized. It wasn't part of any advocacy work or speaking engagement. It was a quiet, personal visit, an attempt perhaps at reconciliation, or simply a moment of closeness with those she still loved. Despite everything, despite the years of estrangement, threats, and court battles, Fadime had never stopped caring for her mother and sisters. And they, in turn, had continued to maintain a fragile line of contact with her, separate from the men in the family who had condemned her so severely. The apartment belonged to one of her sisters. It was modest and familiar, the kind of space that might seem utterly unremarkable to most. But within those walls, the weight of family history pressed against every surface. Conversations were cautious but affectionate. There was no shouting that night, no dramatic confrontation, just the kind of uneasy peace that sometimes passes between people who wish things had turned out differently. But the peace was short-lived. At approximately 9:45 p.m., someone knocked on the apartment door. Fadime's father, Rami Shahindal, had arrived unannounced and unexpectedly. Before we continue, if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. Tap the like button to help us reach more people with stories that matter. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Fadime's place? What does courage mean to you? More stories like Fadime's are coming, and your support ensures they're never silenced. Now, back to her fight for freedom. By then, he had been aware of Fadime's continued public advocacy. He had seen the interviews. He had heard the speech she gave at the Swedish Parliament just 2 months earlier. A speech in which she spoke directly about the pain of family estrangement, of being threatened by those she loved. To Rami, these statements weren't just embarrassing. They were perceived as acts of public dishonor. His daughter had defied his authority and then exposed that defiance to an entire nation. It was more than he was willing to tolerate. Accounts of what happened next came from the survivors, Fadim's mother and sisters, who witnessed the final moments. When Rami entered the apartment, Fadime was standing in the hallway. The atmosphere changed immediately. He said nothing at first. His presence alone was unsettling. He had come under the guise of a family visit, but there was nothing peaceful about the way he moved. In a matter of seconds, the situation escalated into something unimaginable, irreversible. The air in the small apartment had been tense but quiet. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. Instead, with chilling deliberateness, he pulled a small firearm from his coat, a gesture so sudden and foreign in that domestic setting that no one could react in time. Before anyone could scream, before anyone could shield her, before a single word was exchanged, he fired. The first bullet struck Fadime in the head, the second in the jaw. The shots rang out sharply in the narrow hallway, echoing against tile and plaster. She collapsed immediately. No chance to scream, no time to plead, no moment to ask why. Her body hit the floor, and with it, years of courage, sacrifice, and hope came to a brutal halt. Her mother and sisters stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. The silence after the gunshots was almost louder than the violence itself. A silence filled with horror, disbelief, and the dawning realization that the unthinkable had happened right before their eyes. The call to emergency services came at 9:54 p.m. The voice on the other end, shaken and fragmented, could barely articulate the words. By the time paramedics arrived, Fadime was already gone. She was pronounced dead at the scene. A pool of blood marked the spot where she had fallen. The same hallway where she had once walked in with cautious hope was now a crime scene. And Rami? He didn't flee. He didn't run. He didn't try to hide the weapon. He waited in the apartment, calm, composed, as though he had done what he believed was necessary. When questioned, he gave no apologies. Only explanations. He said he had restored his family's honor, that she had shamed them long enough, that his daughter had deserved what she got. This was no act of desperation or emotional breakdown. This was a premeditated execution, methodical, cold, and deeply rooted in a belief system that saw a woman's independence as treachery, a belief that her voice had become too loud, her choices too bold, her freedom too dangerous to tolerate. It was, by every definition, an honor killing, a term often whispered in human rights circles or referenced in academic reports about distant lands. But on that cold January night in Uppsala, it was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a name, a body. Fadime Shahindal. By dawn, the news spread like wildfire. Swedish media outlets ran her photo on their front pages, her smiling face now framed by headlines of betrayal and murder. On radio stations, television talk shows, and news bulletins, the question echoed again and again, how could this happen here? It wasn't just the horror of the killing that stunned the nation. It was the precision, the clarity. A father, in full view of his family, had calmly and deliberately ended the life of his daughter, and had done so not in a moment of rage, but in calculated response to her choices. He believed he was restoring something sacred. But to a nation watching in horror, he had shattered something far more important, the illusion that such violence only happened elsewhere. Her murder reignited public debate over the limits of multicultural tolerance and the obligations of the state to protect individuals, even from their own relatives. Politicians, activists, and journalists demanded answers. How could someone so visibly at risk still be so vulnerable? What more could have been done? In the days that followed, candlelight vigils were held across the country. Strangers left flowers outside the apartment building where she had died. Women and men from every background gathered in city squares, holding signs that read, "A society without honor killings," and Fadime, "We will not forget." Her funeral was held on February 4, 2002 in Uppsala Cathedral. The ceremony was attended by hundreds, including high-ranking officials and Sweden's Crown Princess Victoria. It was a moment of national mourning, a moment of reckoning. For many, The image of Fadime's casket being carried through the cathedral was a symbol of lost potential. She had stood at the forefront of a national dialogue about honor-based violence, only to become one of its most tragic casualties. The irony was painful. The woman who warned the country about this form of violence had become its most visible victim. In the aftermath, her name would become inseparable from discussions around honor-related crime in Sweden. Her legacy would shape future policy, but on that night in January, there was no legacy yet. Only loss, only silence, and a question that would continue to haunt those left behind. What more could have been done to save Fadime Shahindal? The trial of Rami Shahindal began in the spring of 2002, mere weeks after his arrest, Fadime. By then, the country had already made up its mind on many fronts. The public outcry following Fadime's killing had been intense, and grief had quickly evolved into a collective call for justice. But the courtroom, by design, would not operate on emotion. The trial was tasked with something far more clinical, determining whether the act was premeditated murder and what consequence the law could impose in response to an act that had already shaken the nation's conscience. In the eyes of the legal system, the facts of the case were largely undisputed. Rami had confessed shortly after the shooting. He did not attempt to flee the scene. He had willingly handed over the weapon, and during initial interrogations, he described the act as necessary, an obligation even, as the head of a dishonored family. These statements removed any ambiguity about whether he was the perpetrator. The legal proceedings would not hinge on questions of guilt, but on motive, context, and the appropriateness of sentencing. Inside the courtroom, Rami appeared composed, but not remorseful. Prosecutors presented the timeline of events, including witness testimonies from Fadime's sisters and mother, who had watched the murder unfold in real time. Forensic experts detailed the trajectory of the bullets and the proximity of the weapon. The scene had not been chaotic, they explained. It had been controlled, purposeful. But it was not just the physical evidence that captured attention. It was the ideology behind the act. Prosecutors framed the killing as a textbook case of honor-based violence, a murder driven not by emotional instability or mental illness, but by a rigid belief system in which a family's reputation took precedence over an individual's right to life. They emphasized that Fadime had become a symbol of defiance, not through violence, but through her choices. Her autonomy, her voice, her visibility had made her a target. Rami's defense team attempted to reframe the narrative. They suggested that he had been provoked emotionally, that the years of tension with his daughter had culminated in a moment of despair. In a surprising twist, Rami partially retracted earlier statements and claimed that the act was carried out by someone else who forcefully eliminated his daughter, of which he couldn't reveal the killer's identity under death of threat. It was an assertion contradicted by nearly every detail of the crime. His presence with a loaded firearm, the deliberate choice to confront her in a private family setting, and the fact that he had fired at close range, aiming for vital areas, including the witnesses present. The court remained unmoved by the shift in narrative. Judges cited the planning involved and the precise nature of the act. This was not the result of a sudden psychological break. It was a punishment, rooted in belief. And under Swedish law, belief is not a shield against murder. In April 2002, Rami Shahindal was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. For many, the verdict brought a measure of closure. But justice, in the legal sense, did not resolve the broader questions that Fadime's death had raised. The case had exposed a fault line running through the intersection of cultural tradition and human rights, one that could no longer be ignored. The aftermath of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. Across Sweden, discussions erupted in policy circles, immigrant communities, schools, and parliament. The term honor killing, previously seen as a distant phenomenon, had entered the national vocabulary. Suddenly, teachers were re-evaluating how they responded to signs of distress in immigrant girls. Social workers received new training. Lawmakers began drafting reforms aimed at identifying and preventing honor-based threats before they escalated into violence. But the national reckoning was not without tension. Within immigrant communities, especially among more conservative families, the fear of cultural stigmatization grew. Some community leaders argued that the intense scrutiny following Fadime's murder was casting entire groups under suspicion. They warned against conflating honor-based crimes with broader cultural or religious identities. Others acknowledged the internal challenge the case had forced them to confront, that silence within their own communities had contributed to the conditions that led to Fadime's death. Meanwhile, grassroots organizations began mobilizing with new urgency. GAF, short for Glöm aldrig Pella och Fadime, Never Forget Pella and Fadime, was formally established and expanded its advocacy efforts. Named for both Fadime and Pella Atroci, another young woman murdered in the name of honor by relatives in 1999, the organization focused on education, legal reform, and survivor support. GPF provided more than shelter. It offered testimony, education, legal advocacy, and cultural mediation. It partnered with schools, trained social workers, and advised law enforcement. Through public seminars and campaigns, it challenged the narrative that honor-based violence was a cultural issue beyond the reach of state intervention. Instead, it framed the problem as a human rights concern, a form of gender-based violence that, while shaped by cultural context, demanded a unified societal response. The influence of Fadime's story also reached beyond Sweden's borders. European human rights groups cited her case in discussions about how to support women facing honor-based threats in diaspora communities. Her image appeared at UN conferences, on NGO posters, and in documentaries examining gendered violence in modern societies. For many, she had become both a cautionary tale and a symbol of resistance. If Fadime's story moved you, don't let her voice be forgotten. Click the subscribe button to support stories that matter. Stories of courage, justice, and truth. Like this video if you believe every woman deserves the right to choose her own path. Share your thoughts or tributes in the comments. Every word helps break the silence. And most importantly, share this video. Someone out there may need the strength that Fadime's story offers. Let's keep her light burning.